Being pinned to the ground by a Kodiak bear is not how most people want to spend their vacation, but that's precisely what happened to one airman last October while on a hunting trip in Alaska. Senior Airman Brady Penn and his father Steve could not have survived if it hadn't been for his preparedness, awareness, and teamwork, all of which he ascribed to his military training. This was the story of Brady Penn and his father Steve Penn on how they survived an attack by a Kodiak Grizzly bear, a vacation that was meant to be an adventure, but turned out to be one of the most life-changing experiences. What's up, guys? Once again, it's Deadly Addiction with an intriguing narrative for you. Grab a few snacks because we're going to investigate one of the most terrifying incidents that have ever occurred. When Penn received a call from his father this spring, he had no idea how things would turn out. Steve had recently won a hunting lottery for Alaska citizens, which had awarded him a ticket to shoot elk on Afognak Island, off Alaska's south coast. Penn said that Afognak, like the rest of the Kodiak archipelago, has some of the greatest hunting and fishing in North America, including salmon runs, Roosevelt elk, the biggest elk in North America, and the Kodiak bear, which is second only to the polar bear in terms of size. Over the next 3 months, he and Steve were emotionally and physically prepared for the journey. Afognak is a windswept island shut off from the rest of the world by stormy weather and the chilly seas of the northern Pacific Ocean. The Shelikof Strait, which connects the Kodiak archipelago to mainland Alaska, is notorious for its terrible weather, Penn said. 90-mile-per-hour gusts frequently blow over the strait, making emergency rescue from Afognak difficult. Surviving alone in that type of wilderness requires planning, and the Penns were determined to be as prepared as possible. They examined and retested their gear, physically prepared for the grueling climbs, shot on the range, and discussed backup plans with more experienced hunters. When the big day arrived, he found himself standing on a windswept wharf in Kodiak, looking through the morning fog at a single-engine float plane, which would transport us to the hunting field, he wrote. The Penns were taken on a chaotic 45-minute flight and a risky landing on a tiny lake by the plane, a de Havilland DHC-2 Beaver, according to the airman. Before the pilot got back in the plane to leave, the two hunters and the pilot worked together to unload the aircraft. They were officially on their own now. As Penn and Steve bedded up for the night, the wind became worse. The freezing wind and light rain persisted throughout the next morning until the hunters decided they'd had enough of waiting. The cold was not only the obstacle they faced. The father and son trekked over steep terrain teeming with prickly plants and twigs, determined to punish Penn at every chance. They eventually arrived at the saddle of a mountain ridge and discovered a game route descending into the valley below. That track was followed by the hunters, but each step took them further away from camp and deeper into heavy vegetation, obscuring their vision of their surroundings. Despite the bush, Penn noticed something approximately a quarter mile away that was nearly undetectable against the browns and greens of the forest. The hunters approached the herd stealthily, but they lost sight of the elk among the alder trees and long grasses. We were about to quit up when we staggered to the top of a cliff and found ourselves almost face to face with a gigantic bull elk, its antlers splayed out like giant limbs on a tree, Penn wrote. The roaring of the wind made my eyes wet as I gauged the shot. I just had seconds before the elk moved out of sight or smelled us and bolted. The shot disturbed the stillness on that lonely island, and about 1,200-pound elk fell to the ground shortly after. Penn and Steve spent an hour merely to traverse the valley to where the animal was dead. It had to be an entertaining 60 minutes. The airmen began chopping up the meat and carrying it back to camp, but there was only so much they could take in one trip. The rest they packed in a bright white game bag and hung it from a tree to keep scavengers away, or so they thought. Penn and Steve discovered the opposite the next day. The bright white game bag has vanished. Perhaps it was the wind, or maybe a bear knocked it down. Penn loaded a cartridge into the chamber of his weapon as they got closer to the elk carcasses that weren't in the game bag. He and his father conversed loudly to ensure that any wildlife in the area maintained their distance. The hunters waded into a grassy meadow 50 yards from the dead elk, where Penn was glad to be walking comfortably in the lush grass. Then everything came to a halt with a breaking of branches like firecrackers and a rumbling growl. Penn noticed a grizzly bear out of the corner of his eye, just 10 yards away, ears back, head down, racing through the trees as if they didn't exist. The airman hardly had time to discharge his gun. A paw sent him flying and spinning until he landed face down with his gun under him. As the airman struggled to think of a means to free himself, time appeared to slow down. The weight immediately eased from his back as the bear went to assault Steve. Penn heard Steve grunting as he wrestled with the bear, but it effortlessly disarmed him with a swipe and pinned Steve as well. However, Penn was free to make his move. I staggered to my feet in the chest-high grass and spun around, gun lifted, and fired instinctively, he wrote. The movement was instinctive and automatic. It growled before disappearing into the trees. While Steve hunted for his own weapon, the airman kept his gun pointed at the undergrowth. Penn observed that the bear's claws had ripped the left side of his trousers apart. Steve's hands had a few puncture marks from the bear's teeth, but his strong Teflon gloves had absorbed the worst of it, Penn said. The two returned to the saddle of the mountain ridge, where they utilized a satellite phone to request an early return journey. However, because the wind was too strong for a flight, the earliest pickup would be in another 24 hours. With nothing else to do, the two hunters went back to sleep in their wind-battered tent. Bear assaults in the wild are uncommon. The two species usually leave well enough alone as long as people keep their distance and avoid startling or feeding bears. However, when hunting, the likelihood of a violent encounter increases, especially if a huge animal corpse is involved. Game officials usually urge hunters to calm the bear and yourself and let the animal know you're not a threat. If a bear is acting defensively, such as puffing, stomping, drooling, or seeming upset. However, if a bear deliberately approaches and confronts you in a circumstance where the behavior does not look protective, attack the bear violently with whatever means available. Penn and Steve did exactly that, and fortunately, it worked. The plane landed the next day, and the airman reflected on how his and Steve's collaboration, planning, and serenity in the face of adversity had saved their lives. And that's it for this video. Are you interested in stories like this? Stay tuned because we have a lot more in store for you. What are your thoughts on this incident? Please share your thoughts and comments in the comment section down below, as we love to provide you with what you want. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and click the bell button to make sure you don't miss any future storylines from us. Take care until then, and we'll see you in the next video. Peace out, guys.